The year was 1882, and the wind across the Dakota plains was a living thing. It had a voice that mourned in the eaves of the small cabin and hands that clawed at the sod roof. For Eleanor Vance, the wind was just another reminder of the hollowness that had taken up residence inside her, a space carved out by loss a year prior. Grief was not a feeling, it was a geography, a barren landscape she now inhabited alone. The cabin, once filled with the quiet strength of her husband, Walter, was now just a shell echoing with silence. Each day was a testament to stubborn resilience, a litany of chores that kept despair at arm's length. She rose before the sun bruised the horizon with color, her hands, raw and chapped, finding the familiar smoothness of the axe handle, the rough texture of rope, the cold steel of the water pump. She chopped wood until her shoulders ached, hauled water until her back screamed, and mended fences that the indifferent cattle tested with their weight. She was a woman whittled down to pure function, her heart encased in a callus as thick as the ones on her palms. The homestead was all that was left of Walter, of the dream they had chased west. It was 160 acres of thankless soil and boundless sky, a place that demanded everything and gave back just enough to ensure the struggle could continue tomorrow. Leaving it would be like burying him a second time. So she stayed, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving canvas of the prairie, her existence a quiet act of defiance against the sensible advice of others. A trip to the settlement of Blackwood Forks for supplies was a necessary torment. It was a journey of 10 miles that felt like 1,000, each one measured in the pitying glances and hushed whispers of the townsfolk. They saw a woman unmoored, a problem to be solved. Mr. Harris, the mercantile owner, would press dried goods on her with a sad shake of his head, his kindness a suffocating blanket. The other women, gathered like crows in their dark dresses, would watch her from behind their curtains, their judgment a palpable force. They thought her mad for staying out there alone, an affront to the proper order of things. A widow was meant to fold, to retreat into the protection of family or a new husband, not stand her ground on a failing piece of land. Sheriff Callahan was the worst of them. A man whose authority was puffed up by the tin star on his chest, he saw Eleanor not as a grieving woman, but as an unclaimed asset. A woman's got no business running a place like that on her own, Eleanor. He'd said on her last visit, his voice slick with false concern. That land needs a man's hand. You ought to sell up. Or find a husband to manage things. His eyes had lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl, an appraisal that had nothing to do with her well-being and everything to do with his own ambition. She had given him a look of cold dismissal and turned away, the sheriff's pride stinging in the air behind her. She had returned to the homestead with her meager supplies and a renewed sense of isolation. The world had shrunk to the boundaries of her property line. Inside that border was a life of hard labor and quiet sorrow. Outside was a world that no longer had a place for her. She had accepted this. She had given up on anything more than survival, on the very notion of connection, of a future that held anything other than the turning of the seasons and the slow erosion of her own spirit. Love was a ghost that haunted the rooms of her memory, a language she no longer believed she would ever speak again. The silence was her companion, the wind her only confidant. It was enough. It had to be. Then came the day the silence was broken. She was splitting logs near the barn, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar heartbeat against the stillness of the afternoon. A flicker of movement on the horizon caught her eye. It wasn't the shimmering heat haze or a lone coyote, it was riders, a dozen of them, moving with a fluid purpose that was utterly alien to the clumsy gait of the town's horses. They were Lakota. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the numb armor she wore. She dropped the axe, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind flew to the stories she'd heard, tales of raids and violence that settlers whispered to each other around their fires. She scrambled into the cabin, her hands shaking as she pulled Walter's rifle from its pegs above the mantel. She checked the load, the metallic click of the mechanism, a small, defiant sound in the sudden, pressing quiet of the room. She moved to the window, peering through the grimy glass, the long barrel of the gun resting on the sill. They did not ride like a war party. There were no whoops, no menacing gestures. They moved with a grave formality, halting a respectful distance from the cabin. Their leader dismounted. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the very rock of the ancient hills. His hair was long and black, his eyes deep-set and serious. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt adorned with intricate quillwork, and he carried himself with an authority that needed no badge to announce it. Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger. Her breath was a stone in her chest. The man took a few steps forward, his hands open and empty at his sides to show he meant no harm. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the cabin, on the unseen woman he knew was watching him. He did not speak. Instead, he made a gesture to the men behind him. Two of them came forward, leading 4 strong, beautiful horses, their coats gleaming in the sun. They also carried heavy bundles wrapped in hide-thick winter furs, beaver and fox, their value immense. With a quiet command from their leader, the men laid the bundles on the ground before her porch steps. They tied the horses' leads to her fence rail. It was not a raid. It was something else entirely, something she could not comprehend. Then the leader spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. He did not speak English. Another, younger man stepped forward and translated, his own English halting but clear. "This is Chaitan, chief of this band of the Lakota," the translator said, his eyes on the ground. "He has watched you. He sees your strength. You work this land alone. You do not run." Eleanor remained frozen, her mind struggling to make sense of the scene. Watched her? The thought sent a chill down her spine. Chaitan spoke again, his gaze unwavering. The translator listened, then looked towards the cabin door. "He says his own wife walked the spirit road 2 winters ago. His daughter, Istas, needs a mother. His people need a safe place for the winter, a place the soldiers will not bother them. This land is yours by the white man's paper. It is a protection." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She finally understood. It was a proposal, a business transaction so audacious, so utterly unthinkable that it stole the breath from her lungs. "He offers this dowry," the translator continued, gesturing to the magnificent horses and the rich pile of furs. "A bride price. He will marry you himself. He will protect you and this home. His warriors will be your warriors. In return, his people will camp in the sheltered valley by the creek until the spring grass is high." The rifle felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Marry her, a stranger, a chief. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was an insult. A violation of every custom she knew, a desecration of Walter's memory. Her life, her home, her very person, being bartered for like livestock. Rage, hot and pure, burned through her fear. She flung the cabin door open, stepping onto the porch with the rifle held steady, though her insides trembled. "No," she said, her voice raspy from disuse, but ringing with conviction. "Take your payment. Take your horses and leave my land. The answer is no." Chaitan's expression did not change. He listened to the translation, his dark eyes holding hers. There was no anger in them, no offense. There was only a calm, patient assessment, as if he had expected this exact response. He spoke a few quiet words to the translator. "He says he will not take the dowry," the young man relayed. "It is for you. It is a sign of his honest intent. He will return in 3 sons for your final answer." And with that, Chaitan turned, mounted his horse, and led his men away as deliberately as they had come, leaving Eleanor standing on her porch, surrounded by a fortune in horses and furs. She was left alone with an impossible offer, the silence rushing back in, now filled with the thundering beat of her own confused and terrified heart. The 3 days that followed were a kind of fever dream. Eleanor paced the confines of her cabin like a caged animal. The dowry sat outside, a silent, powerful testament to Chaitan's proposal. The horses grazed peacefully, occasionally lifting their heads to watch her with intelligent eyes. The pile of furs was an absurdity, a mountain of wealth on her dusty porch. She didn't touch any of it. To do so felt like acceptance. Her mind was a battlefield. One moment, she was consumed by outrage. How dare he? How dare anyone assume she could be bought, her grief and loyalty traded for security? Her life with Walter, their shared dreams, felt sacred, and this proposal was a profanity scrawled across their memory. She would rather starve, rather lose the farm to the dust and the bankers, than enter into such a monstrous arrangement. But then pragmatism, cold and unwelcome, would seep in. The outrage would fade, leaving the raw truth of her situation exposed. She was already failing. The last harvest had been poor. One of her 2 cows had gone lame. The cabin roof leaked, and the coming winter promised to be brutal. Sheriff Callahan's predatory interest was a looming threat, and she knew the town offered no real sanctuary, only judgment. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Chayton's offer, as insulting as it was also a lifeline. It was protection. It was survival. It was a shield against Callahan and the hostile world beyond her fence line. His people would not be a burden, they would be a bulwark, and the chief himself, she recalled his face, the profound stillness in his gaze. It was not the face of a savage from the settlers' stories. It was the face of a man who understood burden, a man who carried the weight of his people on his shoulders. There was a strength there that she recognized, for it was a distant cousin to her own. She spent the night sleepless, staring into the darkness, Walter's face floating in her memory. Would he forgive her for this? For doing what was necessary to hold on to the land he had poured his life's blood into? Or would he see it as the ultimate betrayal? The question turned over and over in her mind, offering no peace. On the morning of the 3rd day, she was startled by a commotion from the small paddock where she kept her last milk cow. A low, guttural snarl echoed in the crisp air, followed by the cow's terrified bellow. Eleanor grabbed the rifle and ran outside, her heart seizing. A cougar, sleek and powerful, had cornered the frantic animal against the fence, its muscles coiled to spring. Before she could even raise the rifle to her shoulder, an arrow hissed through the air from nowhere, striking the big cat squarely in the shoulder. It was not a killing shot, but it was enough. The cougar roared in pain and fury, spinning around to face its new attacker. Chayton was there, astride his horse at the edge of her property, a bow in his hand. 2 of his warriors were with him. He had returned, just as he said he would. He nocked another arrow, but the wounded cat, its hunt spoiled and its own survival now in question, chose flight over fight. It bounded away, disappearing into the tall grasses of the prairie, leaving behind a panicked cow and a stunned woman. Chayton and his men rode forward. He dismounted and walked to the fence, his eyes assessing the trembling cow, then moving to meet Eleanor's. He said nothing. He did not have to. The event was a perfect, brutal illustration of her vulnerability and his promise. He will protect you and this home. Eleanor lowered the rifle. The weight of the last 3 days, the last year, settled upon her. The fight went out of her, replaced by a profound, weary resignation. There was no other choice. There never had been. Yes, she said, the word a small broken thing in the vast silence. She did not need a translator. Her meaning was clear in the surrender of her posture, in the defeat in her eyes. Yes, the marriage, if it could be called that, was an affair of stark simplicity. There was no preacher, no vows spoken in a language she could understand. It took place at sunset, at the edge of the Lakota camp that was now being established in the sheltered valley below her cabin. Chayton's people gathered, their faces impassive, but their eyes filled with a deep curiosity. An elder, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, lit a pipe of sacred tobacco and offered it to the 4 directions, to the earth and the sky. He chanted in a low, sonorous voice, the words weaving into the fabric of the twilight. Eleanor stood beside Chayton, feeling like a ghost at her own wedding. She wore her plainest wool dress, a stark contrast to the buckskin and beadwork around her. Chayton placed a beautifully crafted buffalo robe around her shoulders. It was heavy and warm, and the gesture was one of solemnity, of bestowal. It was a promise of provision and protection. In return, she offered nothing but her presence, her land, her name. She felt a profound sense of unreality, as if she were watching a scene from someone else's life. That night, he moved his bedroll into the cabin. He did not approach her bed in the small loft, but laid his things by the cold hearth, a silent sentinel in the darkness. His presence was overwhelming, filling the small space that had for so long been hers alone. The cabin no longer felt empty, but it did not yet feel safe. It felt occupied. The silence between them was different now. It was not the silence of solitude, but of two strangers bound together by a contract of mutual desperation, sharing a roof but living worlds apart. Days turned into a week, then two. A new routine began to form, a fragile pattern of coexistence. Chaitan was gone for much of the day, overseeing his people's preparations for the winter, hunting and posting scouts, but his presence lingered. The woodpile was always mysteriously larger than when she'd left it. A weak board in the porch was replaced. He was fulfilling his part of the bargain with a quiet, unobtrusive efficiency. His daughter, Istus, was a small, silent shadow in the camp. She was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with her father's serious eyes and a deep, abiding grief of her own. She watched Eleanor with a mixture of fear and suspicion. To the child, Eleanor was the alien, the strange white woman who now wore the buffalo robe that had likely belonged to her own mother. Eleanor found her heart aching for the girl. She knew what it was to be motherless, to feel the world tilt and change forever. One cold afternoon, she saw Istas shivering at the edge of the camp, her dress thin and torn at the sleeve. Acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, Eleanor went back into the cabin, took out her sewing kit and a small square of warm flannel from an old shirt of Walter's. She walked down to the camp, her heart pounding with uncertainty. She knelt before the wary child, offering the scrap of cloth and the needle. Istas flinched, her eyes wide. Eleanor said nothing, but simply took the torn sleeve and began to stitch a neat, strong patch over the hole. Her movements were calm and sure. When she was finished, she smoothed the fabric and looked at the little girl, offering a small, tentative smile. Istas stared at the patch, her small fingers tracing the line of stitches. Then she looked up at Eleanor, and for the first time, the suspicion in her eyes was tempered with a flicker of something else. A hesitant curiosity. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning, a single thread stitched in the vast fabric of their separation. Chaitan saw the exchange from a distance. When he returned to the cabin that evening, he found a bowl of hot stew waiting for him on the small table. It was the first meal she had ever prepared for him. He sat and ate in silence, but when he was done, he met her gaze across the room and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a wordless acknowledgement. A thank you, not just for the food, but for the mended sleeve, for the small act of kindness toward his child. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of silence between them. As the first snows began to fall, blanketing the prairie in a pristine sheet of white, the fragile truce in the cabin slowly, imperceptibly, began to transform into something more. The shared space became less of a territory to be defended and more of a shelter to be shared. The silence, once heavy with suspicion, now often held a companionable weight. They learned the rhythm of each other's presence. Eleanor learned that Chaitan rose before dawn to pray to the morning star. He learned that she could not sleep during thunderstorms and would sit by the window, watching the sky. Their conversations were still sparse, built of necessity. The snow is deep to the north, he would say, and she would understand he had been scouting. The flour is low, she would state, and he would nod, understanding a trip to the mercantile would soon be unavoidable, a prospect they both dreaded. But within these simple exchanges, a deeper understanding grew. They were two capable people, each respecting the other's competence. He saw the strength it took for her to manage the homestead alone. She saw the immense burden of leadership he carried, the welfare of 50 souls resting on his decisions. One evening, the main beam in the barn, weakened by rot and the weight of the snow, finally splintered with a terrifying crack. They worked together for 2 days to fix it. He, with his raw strength and knowledge of leverage, and she, with a surprising familiarity with carpentry learned from Walter. They did not need words. A gesture from him indicated where to hold the brace. A pointed finger from her showed him the straightest replacement timber. In the shared labor, in the sweat and sawdust, a partnership was forged. They were no longer just a chief and a widow occupying the same space. They were 2 people shoring up a roof against the storm, together. The unavoidable trip to Blackwood Forks finally came. Chayton insisted on accompanying her. "It is not safe for you," he stated, and it was not a suggestion. They rode in the wagon, Chayton sitting beside her, a stoic, silent presence that drew stares before they even reached the town's main street. The reaction was instantaneous and venomous. As they pulled up to the mercantile, doors closed. Windows were suddenly filled with pale, staring faces. The air grew thick with a hostility that was far more menacing than the winter cold. Mr. Harris, who had once been so full of suffocating pity, stood in his doorway, his arms crossed, his face a mask of disapproval. He served her, but his movements were stiff, his words clipped. He refused to look at Chayton. The true confrontation came, as Eleanor had known it would, in the form of Sheriff Callahan. He strode toward them as they were loading their supplies, flanked by a posse of 6 grim-faced townsmen, all of them armed. They moved with the self-righteous swagger of men convinced of their own moral superiority. "Eleanor," Callahan boomed, stopping before the wagon. He ignored Chayton completely, as if he were nothing more than a stray dog. "We heard the stories, but I didn't want to believe them. We've come to take you home. You don't have to stay with them." The word "them" was thick with disgust. Eleanor felt a surge of ice-cold fury. These men, who had offered her nothing but judgment and unwanted advances, now presumed to rescue her. They saw her as a victim, a witless woman who had fallen into the hands of savages. They did not see the man beside her who had repaired her barn, who had protected her livestock, whose daughter was slowly beginning to trust her. They did not see the man who had treated her with more respect and honor than anyone in this town. "I am home, Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the frigid air. Callahan's face hardened. "Don't be a fool. You're coming with us. We'll run these heathens off your land for you." He reached out as if to grab her arm. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Chayton was on his feet in the wagon bed, standing between Callahan and Eleanor. He did not draw a weapon. He did not need to. His sheer presence was a formidable shield, his eyes burning with a cold fire that made the sheriff flinch back. From the edges of the street, Chayton's warriors, who had followed them into town unseen, now materialized from the alleyways, their faces grim, their hands resting on their knives and bows. The odds had shifted dramatically. But this was her fight, her decision. This was the moment where she chose her future. She stepped down from the wagon, deliberately moving to stand beside Chayton, placing her hand on his arm. It was the first time she had ever touched him voluntarily. The contact sent a jolt through both of them. It was an anchor, a declaration. "This man," she announced, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, "is Chayton, my husband." The word felt foreign and yet profoundly right on her tongue. "This is his home now, as it is mine. And you," she said, her gaze sweeping over Callahan and his cronies, "are trespassing. Leave, now." For a long moment, the world held its breath. It was a standoff of 2 worlds, 2 sets of laws, 2 futures for the woman standing in the middle. Callahan looked from Eleanor's resolute face to Chayton's unyielding stare, and then to the silent warriors who were ready to die for their chief. He saw he had miscalculated. He had expected a frightened, grateful widow, not a queen defending her consort and her castle. His bluster crumbled, replaced by a sullen, impotent rage. "You've made your bed, Eleanor," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Don't come crying to us when you have to lie in it." He turned and stomped away, his posse trailing behind him like chastened dogs. The townsfolk melted away from their windows, the show over. Eleanor and Chayton were left standing alone in the street, the victory hanging in the air between them, as real and solid as the ground beneath their feet. They had faced the world together, and they had won. The ride back to the homestead was silent, but it was a silence of a completely different quality. The space between them was no longer an empty chasm but a shared territory, consecrated by the battle they had just won. The tension had not been broken. It had been reforged into something new, something strong and resilient, like tempered steel. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of rose and gold. That night, after Istus was asleep in her small cot near the fire, the quiet in the cabin was different again. It was charged with unspoken things, with the residue of the day's events. Eleanor found she could not settle. She stood by the window, watching the stars prick the vast, dark velvet of the sky. "Walter would have liked you," she said softly, not turning around. The words came out of their own accord, a truth that had just bloomed in her heart. He respected quiet strength. He would have understood. It was the first time she had spoken his name to Chayton. It was an offering, a key to the most locked room in her soul. Chayton came to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid reality in the dim light. He did not look at her, but out at the same starry expanse. "My wife," he began, his voice low and rough with memory, "was named Anpei too. It means radiant day. She was afraid of thunderstorms too." It was his own offering. A piece of his past, of his own grief, laid bare in the quiet of the cabin. In that moment, they were no longer a white widow and a Lakota chief bound by a contract. They were simply a man and a woman, two souls who had known profound loss, who had each navigated the lonely wilderness of grief, and who had, against all odds, found a fellow traveler in the darkness. Eleanor finally turned to look at him. She saw not just the stoic leader or the fierce protector, but the man who mourned a lost love, the father who worried for his child, the person who had seen the strength in her when she could only see her own weakness. A wave of emotion, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over her gratitude, respect, and something warmer, something deeper, something she had thought was buried forever with Walter. She raised her hand and gently touched his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her calloused fingers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, elemental connection, a recognition. He closed his eyes for a brief second, leaning into her touch. The last wall between them crumbled into dust. Spring arrived, not with a sudden burst, but in a slow, gentle thaw. The iron grip of winter loosened, the snow receding to reveal the damp, dark earth, pregnant with the promise of new life. The air grew soft, carrying the scent of wet soil and budding cottonwoods. In the valley, Chayton's people began preparing for their return to the open plains, their winter of sanctuary at its end. But something fundamental had shifted. The arrangement, born of necessity and desperation, had bloomed into something that resembled a real family. Eleanor was no longer just the white woman who owned the land. She was Chayton Wee, Chayton's wife, a title spoken with respect. She spent her afternoons with the women, learning to work with quills and beads, her clumsy fingers slowly gaining skill. In return, she taught Istus and two other children their English letters, their laughter filling the cabin that had once been so silent. Istus now followed her everywhere, a devoted and cheerful companion, her earlier grief softened by the balm of a new, unexpected maternal love. The homestead thrived under their joint care. Chayton's men had helped clear a new field for planting, and the barn stood strong and secure. Chayton and Eleanor worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. They were partners in every sense of the word. The quiet respect had deepened into a tender affection, expressed not in grand declarations, but in small, everyday gestures, the way he would place a hand on the small of her back to guide her over rough ground, the way she would save him the last piece of cornbread, still warm from the oven. One evening, as the last rays of sun gilded the prairie, they stood on the porch, looking out over the land. It was no longer just her land or a temporary refuge for his people. It was theirs. A new kind of home, built on the foundations of two different worlds, cemented by mutual respect and a love that had grown as quietly and persistently as the prairie grass. "My people will leave in 2 days," Chaitan said, his voice calm. A pang of sadness and fear struck Eleanor. She had grown accustomed to the life of the camp, the sounds, the community. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid of the answer. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. His hands were large and strong, and they held hers with a gentle certainty. A chief must lead his people, but a husband must stay with his wife. He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. "Istas and I will remain here. This is our home now, if you will have us." Relief and a fierce, bright joy washed through her. She had not realized until that moment how terrified she was of being left alone again. The solitude she had once clung to as a shield now seemed like an unbearable punishment. "Yes," she breathed, her heart full. "Yes, of course I will have you." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his serious face, and he drew her into his arms. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. The wind picked up, but it no longer sounded like a mournful cry. It whispered through the new leaves on the trees, carrying not a song of loss, but a promise of a future. A future she had never dared to imagine, one that was richer and more beautiful than the dream she thought she had lost forever. She was not just a widow who had survived. She was a woman who had, against all odds, learned to live and love again. And she was home.
Through a maelstrom of biting snow and shrieking wind, a lone figure on a powerful war pony emerged, a silhouette against the gray fury of a Dakota blizzard. He was Cheyenne, his face a mask of deeply etched sorrow, yet his eyes, sharp and assessing, missed nothing. This warrior, Nako, carried a grief as vast as the plains, a ghost of a man riding towards a scene of utter desperation, a scene that would irrevocably change his solitary path, compelling him to become far more than just a protector to strangers he was about to meet. Huddled against the shattered wheel of a broken wagon, Sarah prayed, her voice a lost whisper against the tempest. She pressed her 3 children, shivering Emily, teeth-chattering Ben, and whimpering little Lucy in her arms, closer to her own body, a fragile, failing shield. Hope had dwindled to a spark, nearly extinguished by the relentless cold and the gnawing fear of what the dawn, if they survived to see it, might bring. Then she saw him, the warrior approaching. Her heart leaped into her throat, a fresh wave of terror washing over her. Nako had once been a pillar of his sister's community, his lodge warmed by the laughter of his wife, Minowa, and the playful shouts of their son, Little Hawk. His life was one of honor, of providing, of belonging. But that world had been violently ripped away. First, a creeping sickness had weakened their village, then renegade raiders, a brutal mix of outcasts and opportunists, had struck while he was away on a hunt essential for their winter survival. He returned to a nightmare of smoldering ruins and an unbearable silence where laughter used to be. His wife's kin, their sorrow curdled into accusation, had turned on him. He had failed. They whispered, then shouted. He had not been there to protect his own. Their condemnation had been the final blow, driving him into the wilderness, a man hollowed out by loss, his skills as a warrior now serving only to keep a broken heart beating. His normal had become the lonely trail, the silent companionship of his horse, and the unending echo of his profound failure. Sarah, too, was adrift in a sea of recent grief. Her husband, Arthur, a kind man whose hands were as strong as his spirit was gentle, had been taken by a swift, vicious fever just weeks before. Or so the weary doctor in the last dusty town had claimed. A small, persistent doubt niggled at Sarah. Arthur had been the picture of health. Now she was a widow, with 3 small mouths to feed and a perilous journey ahead, hoping to reach a distant cousin who might offer them refuge. The small homestead Arthur had carved from the unforgiving land, their dream, now felt like a trap, isolated and exposed. Her normal was a constant thrum of anxiety, an aching love for her children, and the ever-present fear of the unknown. The blizzard was the cruelest manifestation of that unknown. It had descended without warning, a monstrous white beast swallowing the plains whole. The aged wagon, their only shelter and transport, had groaned under the strain until a wheel finally splintered, the sound like a gunshot marking the end of their fragile hopes. They were stranded, vulnerable, the cold seeping into their bones. Little Lucy's cries grew weaker, a sound that tore at Sarah's soul. Nako, initially tracking game more out of ingrained habit than actual need, had seen the signs of the approaching storm and taken refuge in a shallow, wooded draw. It was from this vantage that he spotted the faint, desperate flicker of a fire, almost invisible against the swirling snow. Every instinct honed by years of solitude urged him to ignore it, to keep to his own path of mourning. Yet, something deeper, an echo of forgotten warmth, a phantom memory of his own family, huddled by a fire, pulled him forward. He approached with the silence of a stalking wolf, his war pony stepping sure-footedly through the deepening drifts. When Sarah looked up and saw him, a dark, formidable shape materializing from the storm, her breath hitched. She instinctively tightened her grip on her children, her mind racing through every terrifying tale she'd ever heard. They were utterly at his mercy. Nako dismounted, his movements economical, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The broken wagon, the struggling fire, the terrified woman, the children on the verge of freezing. His face, a canvas of stoic grief, betrayed nothing. He carried the tools of a warrior, a bow, a quiver packed with arrows, a sheathed knife at his hip. For long moments, only the howl of the wind and Lucy's faint whimpers broke the heavy silence. Then, without a word, he set about his work. He gathered fallen branches, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, and skillfully coaxed their dying embers back into a life-giving blaze. He produced dried meat from a pouch at his side, offering it to Sarah, his eyes lingering for a heartbeat on young Ben, whose wide, frightened gaze was a painful mirror of little Hawk's. Sarah's fear, though still a cold knot in her belly, began to recede, replaced by a fragile, desperate tendril of hope. As Nako helped them reinforce their pitiful shelter against the relentless wind, Sarah noticed his head tilt, his attention seemingly fixed on something beyond the storm's fury. A new, more subtle unease crept into her, a sense that they were not just battling the elements, but perhaps unseen eyes as well. With the first light of a pale, storm-battered dawn, Nako had intended to depart. Solitude was his companion, grief his shadow. Yet, he found himself hesitating. He watched Sarah, her face pale and drawn but her eyes alight with a fierce, maternal resolve as she comforted her children and surveyed the damage. He saw Emily, barely a girl herself, trying to be strong for her younger brother and sister, her small shoulders set against a world too harsh for one so young. A familiar ache resonated deep within him. He recognized that look, that impossible burden. He made no grand pronouncement, no offer of extended aid. He simply lingered. He told himself it was only until they were mobile again, until the immediate danger of the wilderness had passed. He kept his distance, a silent observer on the periphery of their camp. But his eyes were sharp. He found tracks, not of animals, but of shod horses, too close to their makeshift shelter, too deliberate. He discovered a crudely fashioned snare, meant for game larger than rabbits, hidden in the brush nearby, a silent, unsettling message. A coldness, the kind that precedes human treachery, settled in his stomach. He did not voice his suspicions to Sarah, unwilling to add to her already heavy load of fear. His quietness was a hunter's patience, his stillness a warrior's assessment. Gradually, Sarah's perception of the silent Cheyenne began to shift. His initial, terrifying presence had given way to a strange, unspoken guardianship. One morning, a brace of plump rabbits lay near their camp. Another day, A neatly stacked pile of dry firewood appeared as if from nowhere. He never sought thanks, never initiated conversation beyond a rare, guttural syllable if she addressed him directly. Yet, his watchful presence, once a source of deep unease, was slowly becoming a peculiar comfort, a silent promise of protection in the vast, uncaring wilderness. The first overt threat did not emerge from the natural dangers of the plains, but from men. 3 riders, carrying the air of hired muscle, approached Sarah's camp. They announced they were men of Bartholomew Barth Regis, a name Sarah knew. Regis was a cattle baron, his sprawling ranch swallowing smaller homesteads with alarming regularity, his methods whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. The leader of the trio, a thick-set man named Cully, his face set in a permanent sneer, offered Regis's condolences for her husband's passing and her current predicament. He spoke of Regis's charity, his desire to help a widow in distress. Then came the offer, a pittance for her land, barely enough to feed her children for a month. Cully's eyes, cold and assessing, roamed over Sarah and her meager belongings, lingering on Emily in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. Sarah, though fear coiled in her stomach, found a well of defiance. She thanked them, her voice steadier than she felt, and told them she intended to keep the land Arthur had worked so hard for. Cully's smile thinned. He remarked that Arthur was gone, and the land needed a man's hand. He suggested Mr. Regis didn't like to see folks suffer. The veiled threat hung heavy in the air. From a rocky outcrop overlooking the camp, Nako had watched the entire exchange. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. He saw the flicker of fear in Sarah's eyes, the carefully controlled tremor in her hands. He saw Cully's predatory gaze, the blatant intimidation tactics. The faint scent of trouble he detected earlier now reeked of malice. The name Regis meant little to him, but the man's methods were a story as old as greed itself. Regis did not take Sarah's refusal well. A few days later, the small, clear spring from which she drew water turned murky and rank. It had been deliberately poisoned. Next, the handful of scrawny chickens she had managed to protect were found dead, their necks snapped, a discovery made by a heartbroken Ben. These were not random misfortunes. They were calculated acts of cruelty, designed to crush her spirit and drive her from the land. Sarah felt despair closing in. The dream of a new life was turning into a relentless nightmare. She considered abandoning everything, striking out on foot with her children, but the vast, empty prairie stretched before them, a daunting and perilous prospect. One evening, as shadows lengthened and a chill wind whispered through the grass, 2 of Regis's men returned. Not Cully, but a pair of younger, more reckless thugs, their courage bolstered by cheap whiskey. They circled the camp on horseback, shouting taunts and crude jests, their laughter echoing with menace. One of them, a lanky youth with eyes like chips of ice, dismounted and swaggered towards the lean-to where Sarah was tending a small fire, a meager stew bubbling in a pot. He aimed a kick at the pot, sending it scattering, its precious contents hissing into the dirt. Emily cried out, recoiling in fear. The man sneered, grabbing a strip of jerky Sarah had painstakingly dried, and declared it looked like the squatter had something for them after all. He then lunged towards Emily, his face alight with a brutish grin. In that instant, Nako moved. He erupted from the twilight shadows, a silent, lethal force. Before the ruffian could lay a hand on Emily, he found himself slammed to the ground, Nako's knee pressing the air from his lungs, the cold, unforgiving steel of a hunting knife resting against his throat. Nako's eyes, usually filled with a distant, weary sorrow, now blazed with a terrifying, focused rage. He made no sound, no war cry, only a low, guttural rumble that promised swift, final retribution. The second man, startled sober, fumbled for his sidearm, but before his fingers could close around the butt of his pistol, a rock, thrown by Nako with blinding speed and pinpoint accuracy, smashed into his wrist. The gun clattered uselessly to the earth. The man howled in pain, clutching his shattered hand, all bravado draining from his face, replaced by stark terror. Nako's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the chilling weight of an avalanche. He told them to leave. Now, and to tell Regis this family was under his protection. The two men, thoroughly cowed, scrambled to their feet, practically tripping over each other in their haste to escape, dragging their subdued companion with them. They did not dare look back. Sarah stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She had sensed his protective nature, but this was the warrior unveiled, a raw and frightening power. For the first time since Arthur's death, a fragile sliver of genuine hope pierced the oppressive cloud of her fear. Yet she knew, with a dreadful certainty, that this was not over. A man like Regis would not be so easily thwarted. Back at his sprawling ranch, Bartholomew Regis listened, his face growing darker with each stammered word from his humiliated men. A lone Cheyenne interfering? Protecting that stubborn woman and her brats? Regis, a man whose immense wealth had been built on ruthlessness and intimidation, felt a vain throb in his temple. He slammed a meaty fist onto his polished desk, the sound making his men flinch. One Indian, he roared, and they had let one savage send them running? Cully, who had remained silent, nursing his own wounded pride, finally spoke. He warned Barth that this was no ordinary brave. The boys said he moved like a phantom, that he had taken down Pike before the man could even blink. Regis's eyes, small and hard, narrowed. Then they would not send boys, he declared. They would send fire and lead. He wanted that woman gone, that land secured, and that Indian's scalp as a stark warning to any who might dare defy him. He ordered Cully to gather every man loyal to him, every gun for hire. They would ride at dusk, he vowed, and by morning there would be nothing left but ashes. The conflict had now escalated beyond threats. It was a declaration of war. Nako felt the shift in the wind, the tightening coil of impending violence. Regis's men would return, and they would come in force, thirsting for vengeance. He began his preparations immediately, his movements purposeful and efficient. He walked the perimeter of Sarah's small, vulnerable encampment, his warriors noting every rock, every dip in the terrain, every tree that could offer cover or a deadly advantage. He showed Sarah how to reinforce the flimsy walls of their lean-to with a mixture of mud and stones, how to create narrow firing slits that offered protection while allowing for defense. He meticulously cleaned and oiled Arthur's old hunting rifle, then pressed it into Sarah's hands, his instructions for its use brief, almost monosyllabic, but imbued with a grim urgency. Sarah, her fear now transmuted into a steely resolve, worked alongside him. The terror still gnawed at her, a cold pit in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by an overwhelming, primal need to protect her children. She saw the focused intensity in Nako's eyes, the coiled readiness in his stance, and she placed her unwavering trust in this silent, enigmatic warrior. Emily and Ben, their young faces pale, but set with a courage beyond their years, helped in any way they could, sensing the profound gravity of the situation. As twilight began to bleed across the sky, Nako slipped away from the camp, a phantom melting into the growing darkness. He moved with an almost preternatural stealth, his senses, honed by a lifetime of survival and conflict, alive to every sound, every scent, every subtle shift in the environment. He found their trail without difficulty, a dozen riders, moving with an arrogant carelessness that bespoke their confidence in overwhelming numbers. He drew closer, concealing himself within a dense thicket of willows and cottonwoods that bordered a shallow, meandering creek. He watched them pass, a grim procession of armed men, led by Cully, who rode at point, while Regis himself hung back, content to observe the anticipated slaughter. Then, Nako's heart constricted, his breath catching in his throat, dangling from Cully's belt, its cruel lines unmistakable in the fading light, was a hunting knife. It was not just any knife. The handle was wrapped in a distinctive, faded pattern of red and black porcupine quills, a unique, almost imperceptible barb carved near the tip of its wickedly sharp blade. A cold dread, sharp and piercing, shot through Nako. He had seen that knife before. He remembered it with horrifying clarity. It had been wielded by one of the renegade butchers who had rampaged through his village, who had destroyed his world, who had taken Minowa and Little Hawk from him. The same raiders whose actions had led to his banishment, his in-laws' bitter accusations of failure echoing in his memory. A torrent of emotions, nausea, profound grief, and a terrible, consuming rage surged through him. These men were not merely greedy land grabbers. Cully, at least, was a direct link to the source of his deepest agony, a living embodiment of the brutality that had shattered his life. A dark, inescapable kismet had led him to this desolate patch of earth, to confront the very ghosts that had haunted his waking hours and tormented his dreams. This fight, he now understood with chilling certainty, was no longer just for Sarah and her children. It was a reckoning, a sacred duty. His profound sorrow ignited into a burning, righteous fury. These men, these purveyors of death and despair, would not harm another innocent soul, not while he still drew breath. The assault began as the last vestiges of daylight surrendered to the encroaching night, the western horizon painted in streaks of bruised purple and blood orange. Regis's men, spurred on by Cully's harsh commands and the promise of plunder, charged towards the small, fortified lean-to with wild, blood-curdling yells, expecting to overwhelm any meager resistance with sheer, brutal force. Barth Regis himself watched from a slight rise, a smug, anticipating smile etched on his face. But Nako was not where they expected him to be. He was not cowering within the lean-to. He had become one with the land, a whisper in the tall prairie grass, a fleeting shadow among the dark, silent rocks. The first volley of shots fired by the attackers went wide, thudding harmlessly into the newly reinforced mud and stone walls where Sarah and her children were huddled, Emily bravely clutching Arthur's heavy rifle, her small hand surprisingly steady. Then Nako struck, not with a direct suicidal charge, but with the deadly cunning of a seasoned warrior fighting on his chosen ground. A nearly invisible tripwire, strung taut between two low bushes, sent the lead horses sprawling, their riders thrown violently to the earth in a chaotic tangle of flailing limbs and shocked curses. From the enveloping darkness, an arrow hissed through the air, finding its mark in the shoulder of a man attempting to set fire to the dry brush near the lean-to. He shrieked in agony, dropping his torch, which sputtered and died in the damp grass. A ripple of unease, then outright panic, began to spread through Regis's men. They could not see their assailant. He seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Another arrow flew, then another, each one finding its target with deadly precision, disabling, disorienting, sowing chaos and fear among their ranks. Nako utilized the terrain he had so meticulously scouted, moving like a vengeful spirit, his war paint, hastily applied streaks of black and white, ancient symbols of sorrow and retribution, transforming him into a terrifying apparition in the dim, uncertain light. Inside the lean-to, Sarah, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, remembered Nako's terse instructions. When a shadowy figure, emboldened by the confusion, darted too close to their fragile sanctuary, she raised Arthur's rifle, took a steadying breath, aimed as best she could at the fleeting shape, and pulled the trigger. The roar of the old gun was deafening in the confined space. The shot was likely wild, but its effect was immediate. The figure recoiled, retreating back into the darkness. Young Ben, his small face a mask of fierce determination, saw a stray ember from a dropped torch begin to smolder near a pile of dry kindling close to their wall. Without a word, he darted out, stomped on it with his small, worn boot, and scrambled back to safety, his small act of courage a beacon in the terrifying gloom. Cully, his face contorted with rage and frustration at this unexpected and effective resistance, bellowed at his faltering men, ordering them to charge the lean-to directly. He screamed that it was just one man, that they should rush him, overwhelm him. As Cully, followed by a knot of his most hardened and brutal cronies, surged forward. Nako met them. He exploded from the shadows, no longer relying on the silent flight of arrows, but wielding his long, razor-sharp knife and a heavy, wickedly effective tomahawk that seemed an extension of his own arm. His movements were a blur of lethal precision, his face a mask of cold, implacable fury. The fight was close, desperate, and brutal. He was heavily outnumbered, but he fought with the incandescent strength of a man who had already lost everything, and who now sought not just to protect, but to avenge. He saw Cully, the man with the accursed, quill-wrapped knife. Their eyes locked across the chaos of the melee. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps merely the primal fear of a cornered predator, flashed in Cully's eyes. "You," Cully snarled, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the dreaded blade. Nako's voice was a low, dangerous growl, each word laden with years of unspeakable pain. He remembered that knife. He told Cully. He remembered the screams of his wife, his child, his people. Their ensuing duel was a vortex of savage intensity. Steel rang against steel in the murky darkness. Nako, fueled by a righteous inferno of grief and rage, fought with a ferocity that stunned Cully and drove him back. Nako was faster, stronger, his every movement imbued with a desperate, deadly purpose. With a wild, desperate lunge, Cully attempted a low, sweeping cut aimed at Nako's legs. Nako sidestepped the clumsy attack with fluid grace, his tomahawk a blur in the gloom, and the fight ended with a sickening, final thud. Cully crumpled to the ground, his lifeblood staining the dark earth, the distinctive, evil knife clattering uselessly beside him. Barth Regis, observing the disastrous turn of events from his safe vantage point, saw his men falter, then break and flee in terror as their formidable enforcer fell. He saw the lone Cheyenne warrior, standing amidst the carnage, a figure of terrible, awe-inspiring retribution. All of Regis's bluster, his arrogance, his greed, evaporated in an instant. He wheeled his horse around and galloped frantically away into the concealing darkness, his ambitions for this piece of land, and his reputation as an unassailable force, utterly shattered. The remaining attackers scattered like frightened quail, vanishing into the night, leaving behind their wounded, their dead, and their broken confidence. A profound silence, heavy and ringing, descended upon the small, embattled homestead, broken only by Sarah's ragged, hiccuping sobs of sheer relief and little Lucy's soft, exhausted whimpers. The first fragile light of dawn crept over the horizon, illuminating the grim aftermath of the night's desperate battle. The ground around the lean-to was scarred and trampled, littered with the debris of violent conflict. But the lean-to itself, though battered and bruised, still stood. Sarah emerged, her face smudged with gunpowder and streaked with dirt, her children clinging tightly to her skirts, their eyes wide and somber. She saw Nako leaning heavily against a large rock, his breathing shallow and labored. A dark, ominous stain was spreading across his shoulder, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a new, weary tranquility. The ghosts that had pursued him relentlessly for so long were not entirely vanquished, but they had, at last, been confronted, their power diminished by righteous action. Regis's insidious threat was permanently extinguished. News of the failed assault, of the incredible courage and skill of the lone Cheyenne protector, would spread through the territory like a prairie fire, ensuring that Regis and his ilk would never again trouble this particular stretch of land. Nako did not ride away with the rising sun. He stayed. He helped Sarah perform the grim, necessary task of burying the fallen attackers, a somber duty carried out in a shared, understanding silence. He showed her how to properly splint the still-damaged wagon wheel, his strong, capable hands moving with quiet expertise. He taught young Ben, whose initial fear of the warrior had transformed into awestruck admiration, how to read the subtle tracks of deer and rabbits in the soft earth. His wound, tended with surprising gentleness and skill by Sarah's own hands, slowly began to mend. The searing pain of his past, the enduring ache of Minowa and Little Hawk's absence, remained an indelible part of him, a scar upon his soul that would likely never fully fade. But here, in this small, broken place, alongside this resilient woman and her courageous children, something new, something unexpected, was taking root. It was not a replacement for what he had irrevocably lost, but it was something else. A renewed sense of purpose. A fragile, tentative connection to the living. A reason to look towards the dawn with something other than resignation. The unforgiving frontier had taken so much from both Nako and Sarah. It was a land of breathtaking beauty and unrelenting hardship, a place where survival was a daily struggle. Yet in its vast and different expanse, it had also, in its own mysterious way, brought them together. Driven out by the bitterness of his in-laws, a Cheyenne warrior, deep in mourning for his own lost family, had found himself becoming not just a protector, but perhaps something more, a guardian, a friend, and in the quiet resilience of shared survival, the unspoken promise of a new, unconventional family began to blossom, a fragile bloom in the harsh but hopeful landscape of the untamed West. The trail ahead remained uncertain, shrouded in the mists of the future, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Nako did not feel entirely alone as he faced it.